Andy Vogelsanger, welcome to the World Wealth Creation Conference here in Singapore.
Thank you.
You're the CEO of AFC Vietnam Fund. Can you tell me a little bit about the fund, please?
Well, we are actually, shall I hold that? We are actually started only 4 years ago, so we are relatively a new kid on the block. There are some funds which are much older, but we are different than any other fund. So basically we are mixing quantitative with qualitative analysis the way we invest, and that was so far pretty successful. So we outperformed the market by around 40% in these almost 4 years we are now in existence.
Okay, and can you tell me something about why frontier markets are so attractive, particularly in Asia?
Well, frontier markets just are so much behind, especially Vietnam is so much behind, for example, China, and they are just fast growing at the moment. Especially, let's look at Vietnam again. It's growing at the pace of around 7.5% in the last quarter. This quarter we expect it to come in around 6.8%. So it's a fast growing economy, and it's still at the early stage. If you look at China, for example, we are at least 15 years behind China, but there was the IMF was actually using a quite nice comparison where they had the GDP per capita, how that evolved in China over time, and now they plugged in Thailand and Vietnam over it, and you can see it's clearly following the same path, and that makes it very, very attractive. I think we really have a very exciting future ahead of us.
And in terms of Vietnam, access into some of the frontier markets can be quite difficult. How can people access and invest in Vietnam, and what are the options between small cap, large cap, the different exchanges they have, etc.? So how can you access the Vietnamese market?
Well, that's actually a very good question, because on one hand, to do direct investments in Vietnam is not possible to go through your private bank. So UBS, Credit Suisse, they would not offer that service, because you actually need to register each foreign investors separately by name, and that makes it very cumbersome for these banks, and hence they don't offer that service. So it leaves you only with funds, mainly. So we have, interesting enough, 2 ETFs, but there's a word of caution. The ETFs are actually not able to track the performance of the index that well. So if you look like 4 years back, they vastly underperformed the Vietnamese market, and that was mainly due to the fact that they could not go into some of the blue chips, which are heavyweights in the index, and hence they simply couldn't track that. So if one thinks about investing in Vietnam, you really need to consider to invest in a frontier, in an actively managed fund, because that's really, for frontier markets, it's quite important that you actually have a more detailed approach. So large caps, you see bigger fund management houses which are focusing on large caps. The largest fund management house is Dragon Capital. We are just on the other side of the spectrum. AFC Vietnam Fund is actually investing in medium caps and small caps, and these companies just have stunning valuations, and that's the reason why we thought it's interesting to go into these companies and invest in them.
Okay, and as you say, ETF performance unusually has been very poor against the index for those reasons. And more recently, we've seen sort of pretty active engagement in the blue chips and them rushing ahead. How has that impacted you, and how has that impacted the performance of the fund as well?
Yeah, we had a hard time, I have to admit, the last 3-4 months, because blue chips really were a very specific situation. We had just Vina Milk, for example, which sold a stake of 3.3% to the public, and then Jardine Fleming came in, Jardine Fleming Strategic Holding came in and bought quite a big chunk of it, and bought more shares in the market and pushed the prices up quite significantly. But interesting enough, 1 year ago, the government tried to sell as well a stake in Vina Milk, and they actually couldn't find enough investors to fully sell the whole stake they wanted to, and at a much lower price. So that shows that the market is definitely on the radar again from some of the more important investors. So, but saying that, so the market at that stage, even though we had a few special situations which pushed up the valuations of the index to quite high levels. We have a PE for Vietnamese standards. We have a PE of 18. That compares maybe in the Vietnamese index. So that compares to the Philippines and Indonesia with a PE of over 20. So we're still slightly cheaper than these two growth markets as well. But looking at the small and medium cap segment where we are active, our average PE is now at 9. So I think even though we underperformed the last 3 months, I think the small and mid caps increasingly look attractive. And we actually have seen the last 2-3 days quite a lot of activity coming into the smaller mid caps. We'll see if that is sustainable, if that continues, but I'm quite positive for the next few months, so going into 2018, that smaller mid caps become attractive again.
Okay, so yes, I mean, can you, talking about 2018 and the outlook for Vietnam, could you give us a bit more about your views there, particularly why the small and mid caps are maybe got some advantage over the larger caps, but also how that compares against other Southeast Asian economies which Vietnam is competing against?
Yeah. Well, I'm very positive for 2018, and that's mainly because the macroeconomic story which we see in Vietnam, you can look from many angles, but it really looks quite compelling. We have on one hand huge foreign direct investments which are coming in at record pace. We had the last 2 years already record numbers in foreign direct investments, and this year, which is coming to a close very soon, it looks like we're going to exceed that number again. So that all looks fine. Maybe a slight word of caution on the macroeconomic front is public debt to GDP. We were approaching towards the first quarter of that year that they have a maximum threshold of 65% set by the Vietnamese government. They don't want to exceed that in terms of public debt to GDP. So we are approaching that. We came up to the 64% level. Now the latest numbers have shown that that trend seems to turn and it's coming down. I mean, they were making huge efforts in terms of tax collections, in giving maybe less incentives, not being as generous to foreign companies setting up their offices in Vietnam, giving less tax breaks. So it slowly but surely kicks in, and I'm quite confident that they can keep that balance. Of course, for a frontier market like Vietnam, which has to spend so much money on infrastructure spending, it's always a balancing act. But in terms of macroeconomic front, I'm very, very positive. Especially valuations in the medium segment and small segment are looking so compelling at the moment. So there will be more money will definitely come into that market. And you read in the press more and more Vietnam is mentioned, so that's definitely helping to put it on the radar. We had the APEC meeting in Da Nang just a month ago that Vietnam could demonstrate quite clearly how they were capable of organizing such a huge event, and as well all the negotiations which are happening around that meeting with their trading partners were very, very successful. So I think what Vietnam left after that meeting was actually very positive. That all should help. So yes, next year could be a very, very interesting year, but maybe if I look at some of the challenges which we could potentially facing is North Korea. Nobody knows what's going to happen there. How to hedge yourself against such an event? It's almost impossible. Maybe cryptocurrencies would be the hedge, but very difficult to say. So I guess it's external shocks which are keeping me awake at night at the moment. I think domestically it looks fine. The region looks okay, actually. If I look at Cambodia, Laos, Mongolia went through a downturn for quite a long time with the Rio Tinto issue they had, and the last few months Mongolia finally is coming back to life in a big way. They're still on very low levels, but increasing rapidly. So that's definitely a market to watch if that recovery is sustainable. But there's definitely more money now coming back to Mongolia. Cambodia, Laos are markets which are relatively small. The stock markets are not that big. You have hardly any stocks to invest. They look interesting, but more maybe on the venture capital, private equity side. If I look at Vietnam, which is a neighboring country, we have now 1,300 stocks listed on the exchange. So that's quite a large amount of stocks. So it's definitely much easier to go into the listed stock market. And then Myanmar, of course. Myanmar, everybody looks at Myanmar, especially at the moment. But the Pope, I think, just arrived last night. So everybody's looking carefully how he's addressing the issue of ethnic cleansing. But Myanmar is definitely rightly positioned to be one of the major attractive markets in the future. It has a population of 50 million, so it has the right size to potentially becoming an interesting driving force. And geographically, it's in the right spot. It has natural resources, but because it was in isolation for such a long time, it still needs lots of investment in infrastructure and so on. So arguably, it's a little bit early still to take big bets on Myanmar, but if you are a huge infrastructure company, definitely you need to be there.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose finally, obviously Vietnam is considered a frontier economy at this time and classified as such, but there has been talk over recent years of it being reclassified into an emerging market. What's your views on that? Will it happen? Will it change? And what impact would that have on the fund and stock prices in particular?
Well, this will be an absolutely massive event if MSCI decides to reclassify Vietnam, because at the moment the market cap is around 120 billion US dollar in Vietnam. It's estimated that in emerging market funds are roughly 3 trillion US dollar, and a conservative assumption is that maybe 0.5% will be allocated to Vietnam. That means that's roughly 15 billion US dollar out of these 3 trillion. So, but 15 billion US dollar on a market cap of 120 is quite a big impact, and especially the hot money which will follow with it, that will really have a massive impact. When and if it's going to happen, I think addressing the if, yes, it's going to happen. The question is just when, because Vietnam has improved massively in terms of corporate governance, in terms of regulation overall. But MSCI is not known to act very, very quickly, so it always takes its time. So my best case scenario or best estimate would be that Vietnam will come on the watch list in June 2018, so next year, in 6 months' time. And then there will be an observation, it will take another year, and then MSCI will then hopefully decide to upgrade Vietnam from a frontier market to an emerging market, effective in 1 year's time. So in June 2019, if they make that announcement effective, it will then be in June 2020. But as we've seen with Pakistan, which just had been upgraded recently, so the last year or that year from June to the next June when it will become effective, actually Pakistan rallied massively. And we expect exactly the same thing happening in Vietnam. So that will be a massive game changer for Vietnam.
Andy Vogelsanger, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me on the program.